Today's speaker, Father Robert Barron, is a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago. He's also president of the University of St. Mary of the Lake and rector of Mundelein Seminary in the same place. He was an M.A. of the Catholic University of America. He did a licentiate in sacred theology at St. Mary of the Lake. He has his doctorate, 1992, from the Institut Catholique of Paris under Michel Robin, author of 10 books, the most recent ones of which are Eucharist and, more capaciously, Catholicism in 2011. This afternoon he will address us on the subject David dancing before the ark, the liturgical theology implicit in 2 Samuel 6:14. Father Barron.
What I want to share with you this afternoon is a chapter from a book that's coming out in 2015. Brazos Press is bringing out a whole set of biblical commentaries, but written not so much by biblical specialists as by theologians, in a conscious attempt to bring a more patristic style of analysis to the Scripture. They asked me to do 2 Samuel a while ago, and I was privileged to do so, delighted to do so. I became rector midway through the process, so it slowed things down quite a bit. But the book is now finished. It'll be coming out in 2015. I'm going to read to you essentially one of the chapters of that book. I have written a little introductory paragraph. The talk will end abruptly. I didn't really write a conclusion. It's just the way the chapter is going to end. So I just want to warn you in advance. There'll be a somewhat abrupt ending to things. The general topic is David's dance before the ark and what that says about worship and the praise of God. So 1 and 2 Samuel constitute one of the truly great documents that's come down to us from the ancient world. Its theological significance is obvious, but it also stands out as a literary masterpiece, marked by narrative subtlety, rich elusiveness, chiastic structuring, and remarkable poetic beauty. Moreover, its portraits of Samuel, Saul, Joab, and especially David the king are among the most psychologically perceptive and humanly affecting in all of ancient literature. What I want to do in this paper is to concentrate on a particularly vivid moment in the career of David, namely the king's conquest of Jerusalem and his conveyance of the Ark of the Covenant into his new capital. The episode is of considerable historical interest, of course, but it's also a hinge moment in the development of a distinctively Israelite theology of worship. As such, it functions as an anticipation of the new and definitive David, who roughly 1,000 years later would give his father perfect worship in that same city. With the defeat of the Philistines in the valley of Rephaim, David's consolidation of kingly leadership was, from a political standpoint, more or less complete. He had emerged as the new Adam, that's to say, leader of a properly defended Eden. But there was more to Adam than kingliness. The first man was presented by the rabbis of the intertestamental period and by the church fathers as priest as well as king. Walking in easy fellowship with Yahweh, Adam was naturally in the stance of adoration, a word derived from adoratio, ad ora, literally to the mouth. To adore is to be mouth to mouth with God, breathing in the divine life and breathing out praise. We might see in the opening line of the Song of Songs, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," not only a cry of erotic desire, but a longing of the soul for worship. Mouth to mouth, one is also reconciled to God, literally eyelash to eyelash with him. So aligned, everything in the worshiper becomes properly ordered, harmonized like the medallions of a rose window around the center. In the attitude of adoration, Adam was, accordingly, the first priest, and the ordered garden that surrounded him was construed, again by the rabbis and the fathers, as a primordial temple. Right praise, orthodoxy literally, leads to the right ordering of the one who gives praise. And it also conduces toward the right ordering of the family, the community, the society, the cosmos that surrounds him. In this context, perhaps we can understand a remark often associated with Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, the co-founders of the Catholic worker movement, namely that cult cultivates the culture. Business, finance, politics, the arts, entertainment, etc., all find their proper place and realize their proper finality when they're grounded in the praise of God. According to liturgical prayer, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to people of good will. One can read that not only as a word of praise, but also as a kind of formula. When glory is given to God above all things, then peace tends to break out among us. We've seen the original sin could be appreciated as a result of bad kingly leadership on the part of the first king, but in light of these clarifications just made, it might be appreciated too as the suspension of right praise, as the consequence of a failure in priesthood. When they listened to the voice of the serpent and disobeyed the command of God, Adam and Eve fell out of the stance of adoration and ordered their hearts away from the unconditioned good. This led to the interior disintegration, the falling apart of mind from flesh, soul from body, intention from action, etc. It also gave rise, as we saw, to the disintegration of community and the alienation from nature. The expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden should be interpreted accordingly, not as a sentence passed by an insulted deity, but rather as the inevitable consequence of bad praise. When something other than God is given glory in the highest, the garden turns into a desert. We might therefore read the entirety of the biblical narrative as the story of God's attempts to lure his people back into orthodoxy. Not as though God needs such devotion, but precisely because such devotion is tantamount to human flourishing. When sin resulted in the destruction of the entirety of the created order, according to the biblical narrative, God sent a rescue operation in the form of a great ship on which a microcosm of Eden could be preserved. This is why Noah again was read by the fathers as a priestly figure, presiding over a tiny remnant where right praise was practiced. Once the floodwaters had receded, Noah the priest offered a sacrifice to Yahweh and allowed the good order he had preserved to flood the world, reconstituting it as a temple. As Yahweh shaped his people Israel, he consistently coupled covenant with sacrificial worship. Thus Abram, having heard the promise that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars, was asked to sacrifice 5 animals to the Lord, cutting their bodies in 2. Moses received the word of Yahweh on Sinai and then slaughtered bulls and sprinkled their blood on the altar and on the people. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, we hear detailed prescriptions governing the offering of sacrifice to the Lord, oblations that took place in a tabernacle or tent sanctuary accompanying the wandering people in the desert. Why would the worship that Yahweh demanded be sacrificial in form? Prior to the fall, adoration would have been effortless. But after the tumble into sin, right praise comes only at a cost. This is because heterodoxy, bad praise, had twisted the human person out of shape, setting mind against will, body against spirit, etc. To recover one's spiritual equilibrium, therefore, was necessarily painful. When someone brought an animal to the tabernacle and later to the temple for sacrifice, he was saying implicitly that what was happening to the animal should, by rights, be happening to him. Now, as we know, at the heart of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-plated box of acacia wood, which housed the remnants of the tablets of the law, the rod of Aaron, and some pieces of manna, all reminders of the Exodus journey and the Sinai covenant. This ark became the focus of Israelite worship, both a sign of Yahweh's presence among his people and a pledge of the people's obedience. Like Noah's ark, it was a microcosm of Eden, creation rightly ordered around the praise of God, which is precisely why the ark was carried by Israel into battle. In the book of Numbers we hear, quote, "Whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, 'Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and your foes flee before you,'" close quote. The task of the kingly and priestly people of Israel was to Eden-ize the world, and hence they would carry this emblem of Eden before them when they met the enemies of Yahweh. One of the central tragedies of Israelite history is described in 1 Samuel, the loss of the ark during a disastrous battle with the Philistines. Quote, "So the Philistines fought. Israel was defeated, and they fled, everyone to his home. There was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured. The 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died." That's 1 Samuel 4, 10, and 11. This represented a colossal failure of the kingly and priestly mission of Israel, the collective Adam. But in the somewhat comical section of 1 Samuel known as the Ark narrative, we see that the power of the true God is greater than that of the false gods that can beguile the human heart. When the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the house of Dagon, the shrine to the gods of the Philistines, the idols collapsed before it. Quote, "But when they rose early on the next morning, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the Ark of the Lord." course, in the attitude of worship. This is much more than an affirmation of one particular ancient Middle Eastern god being more powerful than another. It's a showing forth of this absolutely central theme that human flourishing is a consequence of right praise. The central battle of Israel's God is always against idolatry, for everything that's dysfunctional in the human heart and society flows finally from that primordial skewing. In this regard, the story of the ark's triumph over Dagon is not unlike the account in 1 Kings of Elijah's victory over the priests of Baal. Now, this brief overview provides, however inadequately, a background for the decisively important 6th chapter of 2 Samuel, at which point I'm going to take off my coat. Having become king, David knows he must become a priest, for he's to preside over a liturgical kingdom. In the book of Exodus, we hear that Yahweh would form an orthodox nation, a people who worship aright. Quote, "Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." That's Exodus 19:5. The prescriptions given to Moses and the sons of Aaron, as well as the mobile tabernacle with the ark, were the provisional means by which Yahweh was shaping his priestly people during the years of wandering and during the period of consolidation. But David intuited that these strands had to be gathered, and that above all the ark had to come to rest in his new capital city, providing thereby an unambiguous center for the nation, a still point around which all of its various elements could arrange themselves. And this is why David's establishment of the ark in Jerusalem represents a certain climax to the narrative that began with the fall and led through the formation of the priestly people, the cutting of covenants, the giving of the law, and the invasion of the promised land. Chapter 6 commences on a triumphant note. Quote, "David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God." The king chose a veritable army of his best men in order to seize an apparently undefended piece of sacred furniture and bring it back to Jerusalem. What we're meant to see, of course, is the enormous importance that David attaches to this mission. As Polzin, that's Robert Polzin, one of the more gifted commentators on this text, as Polzin astutely remarks, we're also meant to hear an echo of the 30,000 who were lost when the ark was taken by the Philistines. Baal Judah, or Bala in Judah, is a synonym for Kiriath Yearim, mentioned in 1 Samuel 7, and beautifully invoked in the 132nd Psalm. Quote, "He, David, swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord. We heard of it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Yaar." That's Psalm 132. This lyrical passage captures so well the holy obsession of David to ground and center his liturgical empire through right praise. In the account of this scene in 1 Chronicles, we hear that David consulted with the entire people before making this move, and that they enthusiastically supported him. Hence we see the liturgical people gladly shaping themselves around the ark and around the priest king. The Ark of the Covenant, we are told, was in the house of Abinadab, an Israelite who presumably took it when it was returned by the Philistines many years before, convinced that it bore a curse. Abinadab's dwelling is said to be on a hill, which probably carries the implication of a holy place or shrine of some kind. What's of some interest is why, during the long years of Saul's reign in the civil war, the ark had been more or less forgotten. Was this perhaps emblematic of the fact that suspension of right worship and the dissolution of Israel always go hand in hand? Once he'd found the ark, David endeavored to bring it back. He placed it, we hear, in a new cart, which is to say a cart that's never been used for any secular purpose, and he commences the journey back to Jerusalem. We then hear that Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were directing the cart, and that David and his entourage were dancing with reckless abandon before the ark of the Lord. When the festive liturgical procession reached the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled and the ark was jostled, so that Uzzah, innocently enough, reached out to steady it, at which point he was struck dead by an angry God, we hear. Now, there's probably no story in 2 Samuel that puzzles and irritates a contemporary reader more than this one. To conceive of God's ark as the bearer of a deadly electric charge, or to conceive of God as a cruel tyrant, capable of an utterly disproportionate reaction to a minor and unintentional liturgical infraction, seems at best primitive and at worst dangerous. Much of the liberal enlightened theologizing of the last 200 years, in fact, militates against this sort of construal of God's relationship with humanity. The problem for liberal theology, of course, is that this story in 2 Samuel is hardly egregious. The Bible is filled with accounts of God's anger, God's justice, and God's punishment, and often enough, the biblical authors present a divine retribution which appears, at least to us, disproportionate and exaggerated. So, what sense can we make of it? The one who created the whole of the cosmos, the heavens and the earth in more scriptural terminology, cannot be determined by any limitations or ontological conditions that circumscribe creatures. The one who gives the entirety of the being of the world cannot, for example, be characterized as standing in need of any further existential realization. This in turn entails the immutability of the Creator. It's crucially important to note this has nothing to do with God being cold or indifferent to the world that He's made. Rather, God's immutability means that God cannot change in a creaturely way, which is to say, in the manner of a finite being moving beyond its limits towards some greater perfection of being. From God's unchangeability, we can deduce that God does not pass in and out of emotional states, shifting as we do from contentment to discontentment, from joy to anger, from anticipation to disappointment, etc. As the author of 1 John clarifies, God is love, implying the very to-be of God is identical with the stance and attitude of love. Mutable as we are, we creatures fall in and out of love. We love to varying degrees. We love and then we don't love. But this can't be the case in regard to the God who stands beyond the ontological vagaries of the created realm. But how does this divine love manifest itself? To answer that question adequately, we have to be clear about what love is. For the mainstream of the theological and spiritual tradition, love is not an emotion or sentiment, but rather the act of willing the good of the other as other. But this means that love will express itself in a variety of ways, depending upon the object of love. If I love someone who's on a self-destructive path, my willing of his good will undoubtedly appear as harsh, angry, even punitive, for I'm trying to get that person rightly aligned. Therefore, God's anger in the Bible might be construed as a symbolic expression of God's passion to set things right. We might think of God's love as a pure white light, which upon passing through the prism of creation history breaks into a variety of colors. The language of the biblical authors, drawn as it must be from psychology and general experience, gestures analogically toward the various ways the one divine love manifests itself in the world. As we all know, storytellers tend to express themselves in bold and exaggerated ways, and the biblical narrators are no exceptions. To give just 2 examples, think of the ages of the patriarchs, of the number of warriors mustered for or killed in battle. Thus, when they want to gesture toward the divine passion to set things right, they will often present God, a God raging in anger or burning with indignation, even putting thousands to death. We shouldn't literalize this language either historically or psychologically. Instead, we should construe it as a poetic indication of the dark face of a love, which remains essentially mysterious to us. With those clarifications in mind, let's return to this particular story of Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant. Why would Yahweh be angry at Uzzah's attempt to prevent the sacred ark from falling to the ground? The key issue seems to be liturgical impropriety. In Exodus 25, we hear of God's explicit instruction regarding the construction of the ark. Quote, "You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark by which to carry the ark. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it." Close quote. That's Exodus 25, 13 to 15. God wanted the ark designed in a very particular way, and He ordained it to be carried in a very particular way. The principal problem with David's first attempt to carry the ark into his capital city is that he was hauling it by cart rather than carrying it by the poles. It was this faster but more precarious form of transport that caused the ark to tip and Uzzah to react. Now, once more, we're sorely tempted to conclude that a God who would respond with deadly violence to such a minor violation of liturgical law is surely a tad unbalanced. Yet, we have to keep the symbolic nature of the language in mind and get to the spiritual truths the author is endeavoring to communicate. The entire purpose of liturgy is to restore humanity to right order, adoratio leading to the harmonizing of self and society, as we've seen. Over the course of many centuries, Yahweh had been forming His people in the ways of orthodoxy. And at the heart of this right praise is a decentering of the self, a twisting away from the ego and a turning toward God. As we saw, the founder of Israel, Abraham, was a man who listened to God, and the whole of Israelite life, covenant, worship, prophecy, etc., was a systematic attempt to help the people to listen, to attend to the Lord. Hence, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone, the famous Shema in Deuteronomy 6. It was indeed more convenient to convey the ark by means of an ox cart, but the Lord had instructed it to be carried by poles. A small matter, perhaps, but obedience, listening, is the hinge on which Israelite life turns. God was angry not because Uzzah's act personally offended him. In point of fact, the one who needs nothing from the world cannot even in principle be offended, but rather because it represented a compromising of the liturgical attitude. Now, the church fathers, whom I'm imitating here, are eminently clear on this score. Chrysostom says, quote, "As the wrath of God was drawn down on Uzzah for intruding on an office that was not his own, so God's wrath will likewise advance against those who subvert the gospel." Salvian remarks, quote, "Uzzah's punishment for steadying the ark shows that nothing may be considered lightly when it pertains to God." And finally, Pacian of Barcelona comments, quote, "So great a concern was there of reverence toward God that God did not accept bold hands even out of help." Close quote. There's another theological theme that emerges from this odd tale, which is worthy of some careful consideration, namely that of the divine inscrutability and sublimity. The creator of the universe cannot, as we saw, be categorized in any conventional philosophical system. God cannot be deftly defined or set in easy contrast to other beings or states of affairs. Thomas Aquinas catches the sheer strangeness of God when he comments that God is not in any genus, even the genus of being. Further, the providential range of God includes the whole of creation, which means the totality of time and space. And all this implies that God's activities and purposes in the world will necessarily remain inscrutable to a finite mind. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways, says Paul in Romans 11. The strangeness of God and his actions have nothing to do with capriciousness on God's part, but it's rather a function of God's absolutely unique manner of being and our limited consciousness. The author of the book of Job, of course, makes much the same point in his magnificently constructed dialogue between a frustrated human sufferer and the providential Lord of the entire cosmos. We might utilize a Kantian conceptual framework and speak of the sublimity of God, which is to say God's overwhelming of the human sensorium and intellect. Hans von Balthasar spoke of God as a raging alpine torrent which utterly smashes any receptors designed to channel it and convert it to human use. The divine sublimity is by turns thrilling and terrifying. The prophet Isaiah can exult in the overwhelming beauty of God manifested in a temple vision of clouds and angels. But as the letter of the Hebrews has it, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. A one-sided stress on the latter quality gives us an arbitrary God, but a unilateral stress on the former gives us a superficial and manipulable God. Without for a moment rescinding any of the clarifications made above, I would simply say this: Yahweh's striking down of Uzzah is finally inexplicable. It's a symbolic expression, if you want, of the sublimity of God. The sheer weirdness of God's act would help to explain why, quote, David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. It's 2 Samuel 6:8. Robert Alter renders the Hebrew here as afraid of the Lord, and the ambivalence is eloquent. For both anger and fear would indeed be understandable reactions to the disorienting sublimity of God. To be sure, in a pastoral context, the Christian minister often discovers that anger at and fear of God are very common states of soul among those who are striving to believe in God. On account of this anger, fear, David resolved not to bring the ark into his capital, and instead had it sent, quote, to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, close quote, most likely a Philistine from Gath, who had attached himself to David during the time when David was a vassal of the king of Gath. In the earlier sections of the so-called Ark narrative, the presence of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple of the Philistines had caused, as we saw, the foreign gods to fall. Now, however, while the sacred vessel resides in the house of a Philistine within Israel, quote, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household, 2 Samuel 6:11. Is there a foreshadowing here of the ingathering of the nations, a hint of the blessings that would come to the peoples of the world, when they ordered themselves to the right praise of God. Inspired by this benediction of Obed-Edom's home, David endeavored anew to bring the ark into its proper house in Jerusalem. What ensued was one of the richest and most festive liturgical processions described in the Bible. The king was careful not to make the same mistake he'd made before, hauling the ark by ox cart. This time he arranged for bearers to carry the ark by poles set through rings, as Exodus specified. Further, he ordered that when the bearers had taken but 6 steps, they sacrificed, quote, an ox and a fatling. There's some ambiguity here. Does the author mean to insinuate that the procession stopped every 6 paces to sacrifice, or simply they did so at the beginning of the march? If the former were true, the parade would have been endless and Israel would have been emptied of oxen. But in either case, the point is made that the ark is conduced in a festive but sacrificial attitude. The people aware both of their blessing and of their sin. In the killing of the animals, we see an anticipation of the thousands upon thousands of sacrifices that would take place over the centuries in the Jerusalem temple. Though the practice is, of course, utterly alien to us, the logic of sacrifice is actually quite straightforward. One returns to God some aspect of creation in order to signal one's gratitude for the whole of creation, or for a blessing received, or in reparation for sins committed. Again, the creator of the universe cannot possibly need anything in the universe, but the offer of the sacrifice needs the act of sacrifice in order to become rightly ordered to God. Further, sacrifices involve the death of an animal, so that the inner pain of this reorientation might be adequately symbolized. This great sacrificial procession, evocative of the entire sacrificial history and attitude of Israel, was presided over by the one who's not only king, but priest as well. The priesthood of David is unmistakably referenced in the garb the king dons for the parade. Quote, he was girded with a linen ephod, 2 Samuel 6:14. In the description of the priestly vestments to be worn by Aaron and his sons, the ephod is mentioned a number of times. And in Leviticus we hear that Moses, quote, brought Aaron and his sons forward and washed them in water. He put the tunic on him, fastened the sash around him, clothed him with the robe, and put the ephod on him. That's Leviticus 8:6. Most tellingly for our purposes, Saul, having invaded the sanctuary of Nob in search of David, ordered Doeg the Edomite to kill the priests. We are told, quote, on that day he killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. 1 Samuel 22:18. Quite clearly, David had decided, in putting on the garment of the priesthood, to assume the role and take up the task of those fallen victims of Saul. But he was also hearkening back to Samuel, Eli, and the Aaronic priesthood, as well as the priesthood of Adam, the first one to assume the stance of adoration. And only in light of the connection to Adam can we fully understand the energetic dance of the king before the ark of the Lord. Before the fall, Adam would have walked in easy fellowship with Yahweh, thinking his thoughts, moving as he moved. He danced, you might say, in unison with the Lord. What is sin but a falling out of step with God, an insistence upon dancing to one's own rhythm? The whole of the history of salvation, therefore, might be characterized as Yahweh's attempt to restore the sacred dance, to get his human creatures to move with him. Accordingly, David, dancing with energy before the ark, is humanity dancing with the Lord, recovering the effortless harmony of Eden. It's been argued that the gestures and movements of the priests in the Jerusalem temple were intended to mimic in a stylized way the exuberant dance of the king. And since the ritual moves of the Byzantine and Catholic Mass trace their origins to the temple, we could conclude that the processions, gestures, and bows of Christian priests today participate in the priesthood of the king who wore the ephod as he danced before the ark. I'd wager there's still another element of the story that makes it puzzling for most moderns, namely why David and his people would be dancing before, of all things, the law. As we saw, the ark contained manna on the staff of Aaron, but it contained most importantly the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the rather strict provisions and prohibitions given by Yahweh to Moses on Sinai. Most reasonable people in the West today would accept the law, from traffic regulations to required income tax, as a necessary evil, something that in the best of all possible worlds they would do without. Therefore, it would be difficult to imagine anyone dancing with joy before the tax code or the latest prescriptions determined by a county board or even before the Constitution. To understand the coherence of David's dance, we have to grasp the sea change that occurred from biblical to modern times in regard both to law and to freedom. On the modern reading, freedom is primarily choice and self-determination. The roots of this view stretch back to the late medieval period, to the speculations of William of Ockham. For the English Franciscan, human freedom is utterly autonomous, for it's the capacity to choose on the basis of no constraint, either interior or exterior. The sheer independence of the will, he argued, is proved by an act of suicide committed by a sincere religious believer. For such a move against the supreme good is made in the presence of the supreme good. The contemporary Thomist Serve Pincair's refers to this Ockhamist notion as, quote, the freedom of indifference, for it's predicated on the assumption that the free agent hovers indifferently above the yes and the no. An implication of this way of construing freedom is that each moral act is monadic, something like a Whiteheadian actual occasion. Precisely because the truly free choice can be determined by nothing whatsoever, neither the character of the agent nor the succession of his previous moral moves can have a determining influence on his present ethical choice. On this interpretation, law must be seen as a limitation on freedom, and hence, as at best, a necessary evil. Freedom perforce will chafe against the law, and law by its very nature will set limits to unruly freedom. Moreover, when Occam extrapolates theologically from this construal of freedom, he arrives indeed at an understanding of God as supremely arbitrary power. And since the divine freedom is as unconstrained in its essence as human freedom, infinite and finite liberty will necessarily confront each other as opponents, and their relationship will be mediated only by a divine law powerfully imposed. Many have argued that this account of the God-human relationship conduced by a few short logical steps to atheism, for such a God will inevitably be seen as a threat to human flourishing. Hence Feuerbach can conclude, the no to God is a yes to man, and Assert would formulate the pithy syllogism, quote, if God exists, I cannot be free, but I am free, therefore God does not exist. All that follows, it seems to me, from this Ockhamist construal of freedom. But prior to Occam, there was a very different notion of freedom, what Pincair's calls liberté de qualité, freedom for excellence. Here, freedom is not primarily choice and self-creation, but the disciplining of desire in order to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So one becomes a free player of the violin, capable of playing any type of music, precisely in the measure that one submits to a range of disciplines, laws, and practices. One becomes a free swinger of the golf club, able to respond effortlessly to the shifting demands of the game, inasmuch as one has internalized the laws and rules that govern good swinging. On this interpretation, law is not the opponent of freedom, but rather the condition for its possibility. A most important concomitant of this notion is a view articulated in the philosophical anthropology of Aquinas, namely that will is a function of intellect. For Aquinas, the will emerges at the moment when the mind understands the good as good. And this entails that the objective good never stands over and against freedom as a constraint, but rather informs it and guides it at every turn. And the theological implications are significantly non-Ockhamist. God is free not inasmuch as he stands in sovereign indifference to the yes and the no, but inasmuch as he can only say yes. That is, in the measure that his will is utterly congruent with the goodness of his being. God and freedom so construed, the divine will is not a threat to human flourishing, just the contrary. And hence the sacred law is indeed something in the presence of which a grateful humanity might be tempted to dance. I'll make a final set of observations, associations before turning from David's dance. A connection that the fathers of the church made with particular enthusiasm was between the Ark of the Covenant, which bore the divine law, and Mary of Nazareth, who bore the divine presence in the fullest possible sense. Hence Maximus of Turin says, quote, but what would we say the Ark was if not Holy Mary, since the Ark carried within it the tables of the covenant, while Mary bore the master of that same covenant, close quote. One of the many artistic depictions of this patristic association is the relief of a juxtaposed Marian ark, which is carved in stone over the left portal at Notre Dame in Paris. A number of symbolic echoes now can be heard. David arose and went to get the ark, which was in the house of Abinadab, situated, as we heard, on a hill, probably a shrine in the country of Judah. And in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that just after the Annunciation, quote, Mary set out and went in haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. Luke 1:39. In other words, the supreme ark, like its prototype, situates itself on a hilltop shrine in Judea. I don't say shrine casually here, for Zechariah is a temple priest, and Elizabeth a descendant of Aaron, the first priest. Further, after the death of Uzzah, David said, quote, how can the ark of the Lord come into my care? 2 Samuel 6:9. And upon receiving her cousin, Elizabeth said, quote, and why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? Luke 1:43. Both David and Elizabeth are unworthy to be in the presence of the bearer of the Lord. The king danced with all his might before the ark, and, quote, when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb. Luke 1:41. The unborn John the Baptist performing an infant's dance in the presence of the true ark. Finally, an intriguing detail, after the Uzzah incident, David sent the ark, as we saw, to the home of Obed-Edom, where it stayed for 3 months. And after delivering her great Magnificat, quote, Mary remained with her, Elizabeth, about 3 months, and then returned to her home. Luke 1:56. There can be little doubt that Luke is consciously echoing these stories of the ark in order to highlight Mary's identity as Theotokos. Now, as the procession wound its way into the city, it caught the attention of Michal, the daughter of Saul, the first wife of David, who watched from a window high above the scene. We are told, quote, she despised him in her heart. 2 Samuel 6:16. We can only begin to imagine the texture of her feelings at this point in the narrative. She had witnessed the deaths of her father and brother and the fall of Saul's kingdom. Her husband had gone on to marry several other women and fathered children with them while she remained childless. And David had her beloved second husband torn away from her as part of a cynical political game. Certainly she had a right to feel angry and resentful toward the one whom she knew as an upstart shepherd boy who would now become king in the place of Saul and instead of Jonathan. Significantly, Michal is referred to in this short section not as the wife of David, but consistently as the daughter of Saul, signaling that she represents the fading house of the former king. That she gazes down from a window rather than participating in the celebration indicates that she represents the Saulite past. From her height, she regards David with the same haughty disdain that her father once showed to his rival. Before resuming the story of Michal, the narrator lingers over David's performance of a variety of priestly and kingly tasks. First, he established the ark in its tent or tabernacle within the holy city, thus anticipating the eventual installation of the ark in a proper temple by his son Solomon. Next, he offered up burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, 2 prototypes of what would become temple sacrifice. And finally, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, 2 Samuel 6:18. Going into the ark, offering sacrifice, and then returning to bless the assembled crowd, David is anticipating the moves of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, reconciling Yahweh and Israel and establishing a new garden. Finally, David performed a distinctively kingly act, feeding, quote, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins, 2 Samuel 6:19. Here he's Moses, who promised to give the people food and drink during their sojourn in the desert. And he's Joshua, who pledged to bring Israel to a land flowing with milk and honey. And he's Adam, sharing the fruitfulness of the garden. The ark, which was constructed in the shadow of Sinai, had finally found a resting place, and Jerusalem was thereby established as the center of Israelite worship, the still point around which the nation could turn. After performing these priestly and kingly functions, David returned home to his less than contented wife. Astonishingly, the conversation that follows is the only dialogue between Michal and David recorded in the Samuel literature. In 1 Samuel 19, she had urgently instructed David to flee from Saul, but we heard nothing of David's response to her in that episode. When we finally hear them speak to one another, we perceive only sarcasm, anger, and recrimination. Not content to wait for her husband to come in, Michal went out with energy to meet him and then poured invective into his ear. Quote, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." 2 Samuel 6:20. The verb for uncovering clearly has a sexual connotation, reflecting Michal's insinuation that David had crudely been offering his nakedness for the delighted contemplation of slave girls. There's no question there's more than a hint of sexual jealousy in Michal's observation, as well as a foreshadowing of dangers to come through David's sexual imprudence. But the king's willingness to expose his nakedness, even in that most public of settings, also harkens back to the garden and the time before the fall, when Adam and Eve walked unselfconsciously naked in one another's presence and in the sight of the Lord. That the nakedness of David is revealed precisely in the act of worship only reinforces the connection to the Adam of innocent prelapsarian adoratio. The king's response to his first wife is both psychologically devastating and theologically interesting. Quote, "It was before the Lord, who chose me in place of your father and all your household, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord." 2 Samuel 6:21. With those words, David put paid to the notion that the house of Saul would have any say in the governance of Israel. It had perhaps been the hope of Saul in his more lucid moments that his house would endure precisely through the son of David and Michal. But Saul himself, when the wicked spirit was upon him, had so interrupted their marriage that no progeny came from it. Now David is definitively shutting the door on that possibility, and thereby shutting down the Saulite line. Moreover, the decision of David is given quasi-divine sanction, since a sort of curse settled upon her from that moment. Quote, "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." 2 Samuel 6:23. Now, I said David's rejoinder was also theologically interesting, and this for several reasons. First, we see the paradox that a person's debasement before God is tantamount not to diminution, but to elevation and enhancement. If one human being debased himself before another, such an act would indeed be humiliating and dehumanizing. For a competitiveness or zero-sum dynamic does obtain among finite things. However, as I've been saying over and over, the Creator God is not one being, however supreme among many. And therefore, there is no ontological competition between him and creatures. God does not stand over and against the world, but exists precisely as the ground of the world's existence. Accordingly, the debasement of a human being before God does not result in that person's annihilation, but rather in his fulfillment. It's this very paradoxical quality of the biblical God's relationship with humanity that permits St. Irenaeus to assert the glory of God as a human being fully alive. And this is why David can honor Yahweh precisely through an exuberant dance and in the spirit of joy. Secondly, the episode sheds considerable light on the relationship between political power and the authority of God. King David's obeisance before God is a clear indication that he realizes his worldly rule must be situated in the context of God's providence and placed upon the foundation of moral principles derived from God. Once more, the correlation to the kingship of Adam is illuminating. The first man functioned as a good ruler of Eden as long as he was obedient to the divine word and responsive to the promptings of the divine spirit. But his kingship foundered the moment he seized for himself the prerogative of determining the difference between good and evil, when he arrogated to himself the power to establish the moral foundation for his kingly choices. This move, which is functionally equivalent to the suspension of orthodoxy, leads inevitably to expulsion from the garden and to loss of rule. Once more, the whole of the biblical narrative, from Genesis to the account of David's kingly dance, might be construed as the story of humanity struggling to recover the right relationship between human and divine authority. Again and again, the biblical authors tell us that earthly kings are rightly conceived under the aegis of God, and they consistently show us the devastation, both personal and societal, that follows from the laying aside of this truth. The lords of the Tower of Babel, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the kings of the Amalekites and Philistines, all recapitulate the sin of Adam and set themselves up as the criterion of good and evil. But Israel in principle was meant to be the countersign, a corporate Adam, a people whose political and cultural life unfolded according to God's will and principle. In his treatise on law, Thomas Aquinas teaches that positive law, which is to say the concrete prescriptions by which society is governed, is derivative from the natural law, the first principles of morality and their immediate applications, which in turn is grounded in the eternal law, which is none other than the reasonability of the divine mind itself. When this nesting relationship is overlooked, positive law becomes but an expression of the will to power of the legislator, and the moral integrity of a society so governed is fatally compromised. At least a vestige of this Thomistic understanding can be discerned in the American Declaration of Independence, precisely in its affirmation of the rights to life, liberty, and happiness, explicitly recognized as, quote, endowed by the Creator. The implication is that the positive laws which will govern the United States must be correlated to the objective moral principles articulated as rights, which in turn are implanted in us by God. Joseph Ratzinger proposes a reading of Jesus' conversation with Pilate, which is apposite here. Under pressure from the restive crowd, Pilate both abdicates moral responsibility and confesses ignorance of any objective ground for moral decision-making. What is the truth? Having severed any possible link between positive law and natural law, he surrenders to the whim of the crowd, asking them to decide whether an obviously guilty man or an obviously innocent man should be released. This, Ratzinger argues, is the prototype of the moral governance by public opinion poll so prevalent in our society today. But what the severance of positive moral and eternal law inevitably results in is, as we saw, the ultimacy of the legislator's will to power. Thus Pilate bullyingly says to Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you?" To which the one who came to testify to the truth said, quote, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above." Pilate's authority, the legitimacy of which Jesus does not question, is nevertheless subordinate to the higher authority of God. David the king who dances with joyful reverence before God is an apt iconic representation of this truth. A third theological implication of David's response to Michal is that in a properly religious context, the ecstatic trumps the rational and the moralistic. In a certain sense, Michal was right in critiquing the king for a somewhat imprudent display. It would not be hard to find altogether respectable and reasonable moral categories, according to which David's dance would be characterized as inappropriate. Perhaps he truly gave scandal to some in Jerusalem that day and was the occasion for lustful thoughts in others. The prim, downward-looking Michal aptly symbolizes the moral dimension that's legitimately part of religion. You might say she's sort of ancient Israelite Kant, for whom religion was entirely a matter of morality, rationally construed. Kant's programmatic text, religion within the limits of reason alone, gives away the nature of the project. But as Paul Tillich once argued, real religion can never be captured within the limits of reason alone, precisely because it involves the honoring of the unconditioned. Whatever can be grasped by reason is ipso facto conditioned. Therefore, the relationship to the properly unconditioned must involve the bursting of the bonds of reason, an ecstatic leap outside of the self and beyond the controlling aspect of the mind. John Henry Newman speaks of the kingly, prophetic, and priestly dimensions of the church. In its kingly mode, the church is marked by order, authority, discipline. In its prophetic mode, it's rational, inquisitive, engaged in dialogue with the wider culture. But in its priestly mode, it's prayerful, contemplative, and mystical. Without the leavening of the priestly, Newman contends, the prophetic dimension devolves in short order into a dry rationalism. The moral Michal might be read as the prophetic side of religion, and the dancing David as the priestly side of religion, which refuses to be constrained by reason alone. And with that, without proper conclusion, I'll bring the talk to a close. So thanks for listening so carefully.